So how do we wade through the threat of continued AI slop? Here to tell us is Imran Ahmed, CEO for the Center of Countering Digital Hate. We've got Brandie, Nonnecke, Director of Berkeley's CITRIS Policy Lab. We've got Pamela San Martin, co-chair of Meta's Oversight Board, and moderated by TechCrunch's Kyle Wiggers. Please welcome to the stage.
This is exciting. Thanks all for joining us to talk about disinformation, not the most optimistic topic typically, but I hope we can hear about some rays of light in the gloom during this panel. So I thought a good place to start might be talking about why we should care about disinformation. I mean, many of us, myself included, think that we know what it looks like, right, and can easily spot it. And it's like, oh yeah, those AI-generated images. It's so easy to tell they're AI-generated, right? Well, Imran, you gave me a pretty good example as we were preparing for this panel and phone calls of disinformation that I hadn't heard before, and it was kind of surprising. So I was wondering if you could share that to kind of illustrate the importance of this.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here at TechCrunch. Look, the example I gave is an example I use all the time when I'm in a room full of people whose first question is, who could be so stupid as to fall for disinformation? And I always get a squinty look in my eye, and I'm like, I've got them. And I ask the question, what vegetable, and you can all answer this, what vegetable gives you better night vision? Carrots. Okay. So that myth, and it is a myth, has been around for 80 years, since the Second World War, when the British secret intelligence services wanted to hide from the Germans that we had developed plane-mounted radars, which is how we were shooting down their bombers at night. So our newspapers carried the story that carrots are what were giving our pilots had supervision at night. And that myth has carried on, endured in our society for 80 years. Now, it sounds cost-free, right? There's nothing wrong with telling your kids to eat their carrots. It's a useless bag of water, but it has a few vitamins and it has a little bit of nutrition in there. But the problem with that disinformation was all of our farmers thought, crumbs, instead of planting potatoes, we should be planting carrots. So they uprooted the single most dense source of calories you can find and started growing useless bags of water, which were no use to a wartime population. So both the silliness and the potential seriousness of disinformation in one little example there.
Now, does it turn your skin orange, though, carrots?
Yes, it can.
Oh, so that's not disinformation, actually. That's true. Okay.
Yes.
Right, okay, good to know. So we know now the threat of disinformation, you know, how it can fool any of us. There's a lot of it out there, right? It's increasing for various reasons. One, it's an election year. But just in general, I mean, there have been plenty of AI-generated examples of disinformation around natural disasters in the US, for example, that have gone viral at unprecedented levels. You know, they're spreading like never before at a scale never before seen. So I want to ask all of the panelists, we can go right to left, perhaps that'd be easiest. Why is this? Why are we seeing this explosion now? Is it the technology? Are we just more globally connected than ever before? I'm curious to know your perspectives.
Yeah, I'd like to start. So first, I would like to explain the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is, the beta, carotene in carrots helping you see at night. But disinformation is with malicious intent to deceive. Those are two very different things. During the pandemic, we saw both misinformation, where there's just general misunderstanding of, well, what do we do to safeguard ourselves from getting this virus, versus disinformation, where it was purposely meant to deceive about vaccines. Now, whether or not we're actually seeing an uptick in disinformation, I think actually disinformation in the lead up to an election has always been present. You know, we often called it propaganda before, and main media outlets would perpetuate these narratives. However, generative AI can scale things much more widely, and one of my biggest concerns is definitely around AI-generated voice. It's very convincing. I'm the host of a show and podcast series called Tech Hype, where we debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies, laws, and policies that shape them. And we actually trained an AI agent based off of my recordings, and it sounds exactly like me. It's very convincing. So that's something I'm very concerned about, audio deepfakes.
Yeah, and not to interrupt. I was going to say that's a good lead into maybe some of the moderation challenges we're seeing right now, right? Like, okay, these tools to make these deepfakes, right, are widely available, open, free. So how do you even begin then to prevent these AI-generated pieces of disinformation and misinformation? Thanks for pointing out the distinction from spreading, right? And Pamela, I think that's kind of core to what you do. It's an important part of your work.
No, thanks so much, and it's wonderful to be here with all you guys. And I think that we have to start off with what Brandie was here saying, that is, here, this is not new. Lies are not new. Lies in elections are definitely not new. They were called propaganda, and they've kind of changed when you have social media, when you're able to polarize as much, when you're able to undermine trust in elections. But when you have generative AI that creates deepfakes, that creates manipulated voices, manipulated images, videos, even texts that are completely deceitful, you have to take into account that it's not only AI that's creating these messages, but it's also AI that is moderating most of these content in social media platforms. Most social media content is moderated by automation, and automation uses AI either to flag certain content for it to be reviewed by humans, or to flag certain content for it to be actioned. And by action, I mean either putting a warning screen, removing, downranking in the algorithms, etc. There's different actions that the platforms take on content, but most of it has to do with through AI. What has the problem been up to now? That AI up to now has not been very good at accounting for context. And the same message can be completely different depending on the context in which it occurs. And I always give an example. If I told anybody here in the audience, let's kill cockroaches, we'd all say, yes, please, do. They're gross, they're horrible. I mean, we don't like cockroaches, especially in our kitchens. We never like cockroaches. But if in Rwanda we had a message saying kill the cockroaches, what we were calling was calling for genocide. And there's a big difference between wanting to kill an animal in your kitchen and wanting to call for genocide. And that is something that AI models that moderate content are not too good at, and that it is expected for them to get better. And if they do get better, there can be something that can become very useful to addressing this, acknowledging that not all misinformation or even disinformation necessarily needs to be removed. There can be much misinformation or disinformation that only needs to be informed. For example, putting labels on misinformation. Of course, then you have other AI-generated content, but be it misinformation or disinformation or not, that actually causes harm. Let's think of deepfake sexual images. That is extremely harmful, especially to women and girls. Let's talk teenagers, let's go to celebrities, let's go to politicians. But that, of course, needs to be removed quickly, and has to have good avenues for reporting even.
You want to go?
If I just
to go back to the original question, which is, and to the question of this session, which is how generative AI is flooding the web with disinformation. While it is true, as both, Brandie and Pamela have said, that we've always had BS in politics. I mean, a lot of politicians use lying as an art, a tool of doing politics. What we have now is quantitatively different. And to such a scale that we're not in the conventional race. It's like comparing the conventional arms race of BS in politics to the nuclear race. Because what we have is it's the economics that have changed so radically. The marginal cost of the production of a piece of disinformation has been reduced to zero by generative AI, if there are no guardrails on those platforms. And the marginal costs of the distribution of disinformation, so for each additional message to each additional person, the marginal cost to the sender is zero, to the distributor. And when you have zero marginal cost for the production and zero marginal cost for the distribution, that's moving from the nuclear age of disinformation, which we saw in the last 8 years, where we saw social media being used to turbocharge, in fact, quite often algorithmically amplified disinformation, something that Mark himself acknowledged when he said that that the more violative content is, the more likely it is to get engagement. It's sort of a flat line until it reaches the margins of being violative, and then it shoots up in an exponential curve. You've got that happening, but then you have the second layer of generative AI. The only cost for producing disinformation used to be the effort of production. Now that's zero too. And so what you have, theoretically, is a perfect loop system in which generative AI is producing, it's distributing, and then it's assessing the performance, A/B testing, and then improving. You've got a perpetual bullshit machine. That's quite worrying. Not quite sure that we should be creating that within democracies that rely upon some degree of truth and some degree of epistemic authority, some degree of epistemic weight to the information that we promulgate to each other in order to maintain the basis for democracy, that we all know the language that we're all speaking.
If I could add to this, I will say, well,
Of course.
what do we do about this? Now, in the state of California, Governor Newsom signed 3 bills into law that try to address these very issues. One would require the developers of generative AI to also develop detection tools that would be made available to the public so that they can detect whether or not something is AI generated. A second bill signed into law will require platforms to remove this very malicious disinformation from their platforms and suppress it. And the third law makes it punishable if you create and distribute non-consensual deepfake imagery. So we have yet to see, because these were just signed into law last month and will go into effect early this year and early the next year. We'll have to wait and see, will this actually be effective? Can we build out these technical tools for identification of generative AI? There's also the requirement for essentially watermarking on AI-generated content. And I don't really like to use the term watermarking because I think all of our minds go back to, images that we would maybe pull from the internet and use a clone stamp tool on Photoshop and, get rid of. I'm sure none of you did that in this room. But these AI-generated images would essentially have this embedded cryptographic hash that you cannot remove, be extremely difficult to remove. And the goal then is that platforms would cooperate and flag that content. No judgment on what it is, but just say, look, we know that this is AI generated, and at least that could inform the public to some skepticism.
If I may, 1 second. There's one thing, and I agree with what you said, Imran, but we thought this year that had 80 elections would be the year of AI in elections, that all the elections throughout the world would be flooded of AI deepfakes, that would be what controlled the narrative this year of elections. We have seen a rise in it, but we have not seen elections being completely flooded with AI-generated content. Why do I say that? Not because I disagree that it is very concerning, but I also think that we have to keep in mind that if we start taking measures out of fear, we will lose the good part of AI, we will lose the positive thing. That could be Modi using AI.
That was the example I was going to use. But
Right.
you said it,
Yeah,
yeah.
Modi using AI in order to translate all his discourses into the different languages in India, which in India makes a lot of sense. But I'm just saying, I think we have to keep a certain balance between what is a potentially enormous problem, which is true, and then that'll make us be able to see the regulation with clearer eyes, but also make us see who we have to start holding accountable for. And Brandie was very good at saying, we're hoping platforms will help with this. Of course, we're not only hoping, we would expect platforms to help in informing people in what's going on, but also in seeing who's accountable for making it so easy to spread these narratives. Because it's not only the malicious actor who makes it easier. There's also algorithms that operate on platforms that we don't know how they operate, that there's very little transparency on that, and that also has an impact on what happens.
Now, Imran, not to cut you off, and I will give you a chance to respond, but I just wanted to point out we have kind of a conflict here. Not a conflict, I mean, it could be a complement, but we've talked about regulation in terms of government regulation, right? And Pamela, you're a member of an organization that is an example of self-regulation, right? The Oversight Board is self-regulating Meta, right? Or your attempt is to, be kind of a check on what Meta does, how it moderates on its various platforms, for example, the types of content it moderates, and you ideally point out its failings, right? I want to ask you, how do you think Meta has done lately in this area, the disinformation area? Would you say that Meta has taken your recommendations and suggestions into account and actually made changes to reflect your concerns?
I think that it will be completely untrue to say that any social media platform is doing everything they have to do. Especially, I would not say that about Meta. There have been recommendations that have been made. There have been recommendations that have been taken, especially with disinformation, labeling content that is misleading, so that people are informed of it being misleading. That one was accepted, and I think that is the adequate way forward. We also made another recommendation that we also expect to be addressed. When you do have harmful content with deepfake sexual images of women, trying to make it easier to, one, identify non-consent, two, not rely on public reporting, because when you're a public figure, public reporting might be something that could be relevant. But when you're a private figure, public reporting will not be something that is useful. And I think that what we have to push all the social media platforms is to not only comply when they are forced to comply. That means regulation is necessary. I'm very concerned when it's speech related, but I'm completely for regulation when it has to do with transparency and accountability. But we have to, I think that what we should expect from all social media platforms is to, when they say that they will hold themselves accountable, that they will comply with ethics principles when using AI moderation tools, it's not only saying that you will comply, it's actually doing something to have some oversight. There's the Oversight Board model. There can be many other models for different social media platforms, but social media platforms do have enough power to actually, for us to actually hold them accountable for what they're doing.
Can I say I disagree? Actually, I don't think that these transparency reports really do anything, in part because in these transparency reports, they'll say, look at what a great job we're doing. We removed, tens of thousands of pieces of harmful content. Well, what didn't you remove? What's still floating around that you didn't catch? And especially the work of the Oversight Board, you take very high-profile examples. But there are more of these other cases happening on the platform. So by having these transparency reports, it gives a false sense that they're actually doing due diligence, when I think underneath that calm is a big mess of them trying to figure out how to deal with all of this content.
And I think it's also important to point out that I saw a stat last year. Only around half, I think, of the Oversight Board's recommendations were taken into account, basically had any tangible impact in terms of the end user experience. You know, the Oversight Board also had you know, some layoffs in April. It seems like you know, you're trying to do the best you can, perhaps, but you're working with an organization that is reluctant to work with you. And I think, you know, it's the feeling of many. I think Imran, for example, that government regulation is maybe the only way to affect some change.
So look, when the CEOs of the big AI companies went to the Hill last year, Sam Altman and others, they talked about what regulation of AI could look like, recognizing that we're moving into a new phase of the cost of production of potentially damaging disinformation, stuff that might take lives, whether it is stuff that induces identity-based violence, or it is health disinformation that can acutely affect the, you know, someone who believes its health may even kill them. And what they talked about was transparency and accountability. And those two principles are at the heart of what CCDH recommends, which is the STAR framework. So our STAR framework says safety by design is created by real transparency, which allows for meaningful accountability by knowledgeable stakeholders, whether that be a congressional committee, it be experts like Brandie, it be civil society organizations like the one I run. And then when you have created harm, when you've harmed people, in every other walk of life, if you harm someone else, you can be held liable, but not social media companies. So we've said that there should be a knowing indifference standard for the liability shield that social media platforms already have, which means that if you know there's a problem and you do nothing about it, at that point you might become liable. Now, the problem with something like the Facebook Oversight Board, I've gotten to know you over the last couple of weeks of talking to you. Your career is incredible, what you've done as a human rights lawyer. You are a lovely human being. But fundamentally, self-regulation is not regulation, because the Oversight Board itself cannot answer the 5 fundamental questions you should always ask someone who has power. What power do you have? Who gave you that power? In whose interests do you wield that power? To whom are you accountable? And how do we get rid of you if you're not doing a good job? And if the answer to every single one of those questions is the people who I purport to be holding accountable, to Meta is the answer to all of those questions. They appoint you, they can fire you, you wield their power in their interests, and you are accountable to them. Then you are not any sort of check or balance. You are merely a bit of PR spin.
Those are powerful words. Pamela, I'm sure you have a response.
And they're absolutely valid criticisms if they were true. But I'm going to tell you why they're not true. Because it is true that Meta created the Oversight Board. It is true that Meta funds the Oversight Board. But it is also true that it created an Oversight Board with guarantees of independence. Guarantees of independence that I cannot be fired by Meta. I have a fixed term. I cannot be fired by Meta.
What is your salary?
Funds that were moved to a trust that is irrevocable. The trust is irrevocable. It is the trust that pays my salary. Nobody in the Oversight Board can be let go or taken out or removed because of the decisions we make. Meta can decide not to fund the Oversight Board for more time. That is something that is within the remit. That is true. But so long as the Oversight Board exists, there are institutional, functional, and economic guarantees of independence that are exactly what is required for you to have the people that are in the Oversight Board actually working for the Oversight Board. Do I think that the Oversight Board has all the power it should have to hold fully accountable a company the size of Meta? No, it doesn't. Yet, is it a measure that actually has been able to achieve some impact for users? I believe it has. And we have metrics to be able to understand some changes that have occurred to users. The fact that users now, for example, can receive a prompt when they're going to post something that is a potentially violating content, which they can edit or decide not to edit. And you have millions of users, 100 million users in a 12-week period that actually used that function. You have the community standards translated to more languages. That might be something that is very simple, but for people to actually understand what they're allowed or they're not allowed to do in their own language is something that is relevant to users. I'm not saying that the only function or the only thing that should occur is self-regulation. I don't think that's enough. I do believe that there should be regulation. And when I say I believe that transparency and accountability should be part of the regulation, I completely agree. Transparency report saying I removed 3,000 pieces, well, thank you very much. I could not care less. I mean, that tells me absolutely nothing. But for example, one of the things that we've asked Meta for elections is establish metrics, establish a framework in which you can give us metrics of how well you're addressing it. And those metrics are not how many pieces you removed, is what were your objectives? Did you achieve them? How did you achieve them? And actual data that can be revised by third parties.
But they're still writing the exam by which they are graded. I also think, and I really respect the work that you do, I think it's not just the oversight board. You make decisions internally but offer them up as recommendations of what Meta should be doing. But I think it's more about the transparency of the work that you do and ensuring that people on Capitol Hill or in state legislatures are hearing this, and they are the ones who can exert power. Right? We can use antitrust, product liability tort. To get back to your point about platforms being able to cause all of these harms, there's some very high-profile cases like Lemon v. Snap, where a family of a child who was killed in an accident while trying to use a Snapchat filter that it captured speed of the vehicles, and of course, teenage boys, what are they going to do? They're going to race their cars, but they got in, a terrible accident, and in this case, Snap was held accountable for creating a feature on its platform that incentivized dangerous behavior. So I think really the hammer to get at these companies is product liability tort. Yeah. And I actually published a piece in Wired on this very topic. If you look up my name and you want to learn about how we can use product liability tort as a mechanism to hold platforms accountable.
Right. Look at X, right? That's another good example. You have X that's using basically an unfiltered image generator to incentivize users to sign up for their premium service, right? If you sign up for the premium, one of the premium versions of X, you can use an image generator to generate anything you want, really. It could be a copyrighted character.
And there's no shareholders anymore. So
right.
It's just whatever Elon Musk wants to do.
Right.
So that was a form of accountability that's now gone.
We actually put out a report testing it. So we tested Grok to see whether or not it had any guardrails at all. It is the worst of all the image generators. There are zero guardrails. You can produce images of election workers destroying ballots that could flood onto social media. And we know what that can lead to. It can lead to people being hurt. And yet there are no guardrails whatsoever. They revel in the fact there are no guardrails. And I have my own history with X, as you know, having been sued by them, but unsuccessfully, but yes.
Right. Well, I think that might be a good segue. In the interest of time, I was hoping we could end on, okay, so what is the path forward, right? Regulation seems like a good idea, but there have been plenty of challenges in getting that accomplished, right? Even one of California's, deepfake laws is now stayed because of a lawsuit, right? And around the world, it's been, I think, hard to come to consensus on this because, Pamela, as you said, localization matters, right? And there's a lot of nuance. So maybe quickly, if I could hear from all of you. Optimistically, what do you think might happen that could change things for the better? Give us reason to leave this room not totally downtrodden about how things are right now.
We've become such cynics, haven't we?
I know.
So maybe I'll start. I do think that there are technical mechanisms that we can use. I really love this idea of cryptographic hashing of AI-generated content, whether it's video, audio, text, so that, now in text it's a little harder, but at least that would serve as a mechanism for public awareness that something is AI-generated. I also think if we want to talk about non-consensual deepfake imagery, I don't necessarily like the laws that go after those who create and distribute, but instead I think you have to get at the payment mechanisms, make sure that credit cards can't be used to purchase non-consensual deepfake intimate imagery, and those websites don't hide the fact that they're making that. The names are like deep nude, like clearly we know what you're doing. Also domain hosting. get after ISPs and don't host these, make it harder for people to access. So more technical interventions.
I mean, look, I think there's enormous amounts of reason for hope, not least of all because I think the AI industry has been a little bit more forward about taking steps to create more transparency and safety on their platforms. I mean, at the same time as we're talking about Meta sort of having new rules, we know that they bought CrowdTangle for $1 billion just so they could close it down right before an elections, in which would have been really helpful to be able to have a little bit of transparency of what's happening on that platform. But we've seen with DALL-E, for example, with ChatGPT's DALL-E, that they've, I'm sure that's how it's pronounced, DALL-E, whatever.
DALL-E, I think.
DALL-E,
yeah.
okay. That they've actually instituted meta-tagged hashing of to show that it is a watermark in the meta tags, to show that it's artificially generated. And then social media platforms can pick up on that meta tag data, and they can say this is an artificially generated image. That's really positive. The other thing is that in the last 5 years, while Congress has sat on its bums and done nothing about regulation, other countries have. So the UK has promulgated the Online Safety Act, and it's looking to a new AI bill in the coming years. The European Union is acting right now, the world's second biggest economic bloc. So there are things happening, and that's why CCDH has offices in London and in Brussels, so we can talk to the regulators there, because those regulations may well flow back in terms of the benefits yielded from them to the US. But I do think it's really important that people here are thinking about what about the future in which it is inevitable that there will have to be regulation for something that potentially has such damage to our democracies, to our health, to our societies, to us as individuals. I think regulation is inevitable. And so thinking about the post-regulation future, how we can compete for better and better services, not just lower and lower guardrails, that will be the key.
I know that we're in time here, but
That's okay.
I would just say, I think that we have to hold the creators of the tools that generate AI accountable, the platforms that distribute the information accountable. That means through regulation, yes, but regulation doesn't move at the speed that we would like it to move. Doesn't move, we have the DSA, true. It's still going to be...
We should say the Digital Services Act.
Sorry, you're right, the Digital Services Act in the UK. But we still have to see how that will look like, because we still have all the implementation phase, which will probably take quite a while. I think those are steps that can be in the right direction. I worry about copy legislation in other countries where actually more autocratic countries take that regulation and use it for other purposes that actually undermine democracy, probably even more. And that is why it has to be not only industry-wide action, it has to be industry, government, civil society organizations. I do think there has to be researchers,
Academia.
and I do think there has to be oversight. And an independent oversight, I think, is a complementary measure that is also necessary.
Right. Well, we covered a lot of ground, and that'll conclude the panel. I want to thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a great Disrupt, everyone.
Thank you, guys.